So Alex, were you able to take advantage of some of the businesses that are reopening?
Not quite yet.
Yeah.
Haircut's definitely first on my list. I'm
Yeah.
scheduled for that tomorrow.
Oh, good for you. I still got to schedule one. I definitely need one. My
Yeah,
dog needs one too.
the online booking's key. The appointments are hard to come by, so have to schedule it in advance. It'll be good.
I'm curious if a lot of barber shops are doing online booking. I
Yeah,
know some
mine
salons
just,
do it, but
yeah,
a lot of the low tech barber shops, this might be new for them.
yeah, just like restaurants with delivery and Uber
Yeah.
Eats and stuff like that.
It's a new
Yeah,
world.
no doubt. We'll kick this off. Thanks to everyone for tuning in after the holiday. Just a reminder, we're gonna try to take a lot of questions today. The Q&A box is at the bottom of the screen. Anything comes to mind now or during the discussion, feel free to put it in, and we'll be happy to take some questions. John, I know you're breaking a story kind of around the reopening around Boston and the new advisory board. I had heard nothing about this until about an hour ago when you told me about it. So why don't we start with you, kind of talk about what you're hearing around the advisory board and what it is and how it will work.
So if in Boston is taking I would say a more conservative or cautious approach to the reopening than the rest of the state. The offices were not allowed to open until next week in Boston, and they're able to open this week in the rest of the state. And Mayor Marty Walsh has been particularly cautious about reopening commercial construction and construction in general, more so than the state. And there are a number of reasons for that. So Boston's a special case, and you've got people commuting in from all over. There's very few places in the country where the population of the city doubles during the day from commuters. That's not going to happen anytime soon, but the city wants to be prepared when it does. So the city has appointed its own version of a reopening advisory board, much like what Governor Charlie Baker appointed a month ago. This board will not be meeting all day long. The state board had about 45 Zoom calls over the course of the week. But this board, nearly 30 members from various sectors of the city economy, from events to restaurants to offices to labs. A little different than the state board. This board, which had its first meeting virtually, of course, on Friday. This board includes labor leaders. There's at least one clergyman on there, professors for obvious reasons. Those constituencies certainly had a say in the state board process, but they weren't actually represented on the board. They would present to the board. So it's clear the mayor really wants this to be a diverse cross-section representation of employers and employees in the city. And, as he does this kind of go slow approach with reopening the Boston economy, he's going to bounce ideas off of this group of advisors. So that's essentially the group in a nutshell. They really have to, it's not just Boston doubles in population during the day. It's that Boston's heavily reliant on public transit. Boston's got, a lot of buildings with elevators to get to workplaces, which makes it unusual. And so all these particular factors have to be weighed in as the city moves forward in reopening.
Do you think Marty Walsh is going to be able to rely heavily on the advisory board in terms of the 3-week time frame for each phase that we're kind of expecting? Do you think it will play a role, how heavy of a role in terms of, moving forward with phase 2, phase 3 and beyond?
I think so. What I'll say about that 3-week phase, that's a statewide goal. I don't think it'll go any faster than that. It could go slower, particularly during, phase 4, sort of the quote unquote new normal. That is probably going to be more than 12 weeks out when nearly every business can open up again. I think the city will sort of move in a parallel fashion, but maybe be a little bit behind to some extent. For example, the reopening phase, which this is phase one, the start, as the governor calls it. We're in it now. Um, the the offices are opening all over the state this week for the first time. Very few people actually go to those offices. Anybody who can work from home will probably still do so. Uh, Boston will be a week later. Again, very few people will go to those offices. I think there'll be even more work from home for Boston uh, businesses than for suburban businesses, just because so many workers are complaining to their uh, superiors that they're worried about taking the T. So I think, is the mayor, one thing that we may hear about today or very soon is whether the mayor wants to further restrict office occupancy. The state says it can't be more than 25% of total occupancy. Mayor thinks that might be too high. But so there are some downsides with like restricting it too much. So he's thinking about that. Maybe he's got a decision. He hasn't announced it yet. But that's one example where the advisory board could offer some input along the way, as the mayor sort of taking what's as sort of a minimum threshold that's being passed at the state level, and then looking at Boston specific issues.
One thing I was thinking about, and I'm curious about if you've heard anything, driving back into the city, passing by TJX, that massive office, right next to the highway, HubSpot in Cambridge, big office. Have you heard of anything from these larger companies that have, hundreds or thousands of people in their offices about maybe closing down parts of their offices permanently? I mean, Twitter is closing down their offices, working remote. A lot of the big tech companies are following suit. So just curious, have you heard anything yet around, Boston or the outside areas with the big offices?
It's a good question. I think, TJX is not coming back, from what I can tell, from what I was told from their PR person, they're not coming back right away to their offices. One thing that I'll say, like I said, most employers are not bringing people back right away. Many of them will keep people from home all summer long. Some of them will keep people from home, at home, all the way through the end of the year in suburban Boston and in the city. I did talk to iRobot, and their headquarters is in Bedford. They are actually talking about reducing their office occupancy by 50% after the vaccine arrives. So after sort of phase 4 of the governor's plan, well after, when things supposedly get back to normal, we're going to see companies like iRobot saying, a lot of people like to work from home. We don't need to have as much people in the office, so we're going to rejigger our offices with fewer people in mind. And so I think you might see less office space being leased, or you might see companies lease the same amount of office space but just have fewer people in them. I think that's going to be the case with iRobot.
What do you think the trickle down effect on the economy could be with these large commercial spaces? I mean, the effect on small businesses and restaurants and things like that, especially restaurants that depend on the lunch crowd.
Yeah, I think it could be huge, to be honest. If companies, certainly in the short term, it's very hard to get a sandwich in downtown Boston right now. I think many of these smaller businesses that serve the office make it. I think those office towers will eventually fill back up, but with fewer people, just because there needs to be more social distancing. And so that means fewer people buying sandwiches and salads and the like. I think iRobot is not alone in that. Even when everything's better, they're going to have half people working from home. So obviously, people be eating, out of their refrigerators more often than eating out for lunch. But the long-term implication is, I think the Boston economy has really depended in large part on sort of the mix of, universities and tech companies, biotech companies, VC firms. It's a really unique mix here, and it's drawn companies from all over to want to hire and bring people here. Maybe companies remain based here, but maybe they chase talent who want to stay somewhere else, or vice versa. Maybe a company feels like, it doesn't need to move because he can just hire people in Boston to work remotely. And I think that could be, have long-term, it'll be somewhat intangible, but I think that could have long-term negative effects for a place like Boston
Yeah.
and the suburbs around Boston.
Yeah, the work from home decision for the big companies, it seems like everything's connected, whether it's residential rent prices, home prices. It seems like it's all, if the big companies in the area decide to, even go 50% or more remote, it's going to be, the city's going to look and operate totally different. It's going to be wild.
I think so. It's really interesting to think that, just a few months ago that we were debating at the State House the best ways to deal with the need for revenue to fix our transportation problem. And I think that maybe this work from home shift will probably be the most effective fix. It's not to say we don't need some fixes. We certainly do. We need revenue to help shore up the T, maybe more than ever now. But as far as like traffic jams on the highway and crowded subway cars, those are going to be much less of an issue now.
Definitely. So let's talk about the businesses that are in phase one, as well as the beaches. I know you were down in the Cape over the weekend. Let's actually talk about that. What was the experience like, with the beaches, being open and things like that? Was it crowded? What was it like? Were the, takeout restaurants busy? What was the experience like down on the Cape over the holiday?
So we have a cottage in Falmouth, and we went down to sort of, to get a break from our home quarantine and just, get things reopened at our house. And it was really quiet. I mean, it's hard to believe it was Memorial Day weekend. It felt like an early spring weekend. I drove over the bridge last night at around 7, and there was no traffic whatsoever. The beach, I mean, it was a little on the cooler side, windy, but the beach by our house was close to empty. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't sunbathing weather, but you would have thought you might see more people out there walking the beach. The restaurants doing a little bit of takeout, but not much. I was talking to a bike shop owner across the street from our house who rents bikes all summer, and he hasn't seen much business. He reopened. I was worried he wouldn't. Part of the big problem for the Cape right now is that right now in this phase, beaches are open, but hotels and short-term rentals are not. So you would only be going to the Cape if you either had a house there or you had a friend who had a house there. And so I think that really puts a damper on sort of the tourism economies, not just of the Cape, but the Berkshires, and parts of the state, but of course, a lot of people stay open. The tricky thing is to reopen in phase 2, non-essential workers. But there's still, I think we talked about this last week, there's still self-quarantine requests from the governor for 14 days. So this might keep a lot of people from out of state from coming in. I think they still have, there's a statewide tourism advisory board that's meeting, and I think they still have to sort of iron out that discrepancy of how does lodging reopen, but then you require visitors to self-quarantine. So we'll probably hear more about that soon.
Definitely. And for those businesses, I imagine almost all of them have to be seasonal or depend on seasonal revenue. So it must be, this is the time, Memorial Day weekend was probably supposed to be the kickoff. So there's probably even more challenges down there than, within the city of Boston. Let's talk about within the city of Boston, those businesses that I know some opened yesterday because of the holiday. Most are going to reopen today for the first time.
Yeah.
Have you been able to reach any business owners either last week, over the weekend, yesterday about, how it's been going or kind of what the expectations are, and if they're meeting the expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of businesses are taking their time a lot of office employers are taking their time to make sure that the protocols in place, 6-foot distancing, symptom checks, you have to make sure you don't have too many people in one area. That like are the Globe office. I'm not quite sure how they'll do it. We're not going back until the end of the summer. But a lot of people have offices, have cubicles or workspaces right on top of each other. So that's why you're not seeing too many rush back. I mean, the protocol is now available. The specific guidelines are up on the state's website in terms of what office employers need to do to be compliant. And there's no real surprises. I think some of the office employers were already working on this, but I don't think a lot of people are going to be rushing back. And that's, I called it a bunch of people last week to see if anyone was coming in today, and very few are bringing people back.
Gotcha. We just had one good question come in. Do you think small businesses will be able to rehire workers if the workers are still receiving expanded unemployment benefits? And then the second part of the question, could the state work share program be re-envisioned to allow businesses to rehire workers part-time while continuing to allow those workers to receive benefits?
Well, that's a great question. This is one of the biggest problems holding back sort of the reopening of the economy right now. The very generous unemployment benefits that run out at the end of July. It's an extra $600 a week for people who are on unemployment, and it's often hard for employers to bring people back. I know a number of them are sort of doing it illegally, sort of on the slide. They're saying, "Oh, we'll pay you under the table." A number of businesses don't want to risk that, so they're really struggling to find work. It seems like there should be some way for the state to address this, and that the proposal that was suggested there is a good one. I have not heard of them talking about that as a solution. I'm surprised that you don't hear more about policymakers trying to fix this, because this is going to be a real issue, getting enough workers to come back. If everyone or most people make more sitting on unemployment, it's hard to really convince them to come back to work. I can't really blame them.
Definitely. So going back to the phase questions, let's talk about the businesses in the phase 2 part of the program. What, if anything, have you heard? If I'm a business owner that's reopening in phase 2, what are they doing to get ready? What's kind of the outlook? What businesses, if you want to go over what businesses are in phase 2, that might be helpful as well. But what are you hearing?
Just to recap, phase 2 is supposed to start June 8th, tentatively. Like I said, that's the soonest it can start. It may be a week or two more. Knock on wood, the health data is encouraging over the last few weeks in Massachusetts. So, in phase 2, you've got stores that are finally going to reopen. They can open now for curbside pickup, but it's really not the same as sort of browsing in a store. You've got the restaurants, and that tourism committee is still trying to work out, how it'll work. I think you'll see 6-foot distancing, and you'll see masks at restaurants, except at the table when you're eating. You'll probably see a bigger emphasis on outdoor seating for obvious reasons. The state legislature is trying hard to make it easier for businesses to have alcohol outside. It's a bit of a rigmarole right now, and there's legislation being considered to kind of speed up that process. You've got hotels, like I discussed. All of them are sort of, if you're not working toward reopening at June 8th, if you're in phase 2, you really should be. And then there's other personal services, the nail salons and spas that were not in phase 1. They'll be allowed to reopen in phase 2. And you can get a template on the state's website you have to be sort of yourself compliant with these steps. So you have to fill out that form and register it with the state before you can reopen. And a lot of these essential businesses have had to go through that. They're the ones that stay open during the shutdown on back. And so it's a huge burden, but it's one more thing you have to think about. And that form is easily available on the state's website.
Is there anything in there about that 3-week period? So if phase 2 is scheduled to start on June 8th, if it's not going to start on June 8th, when will those businesses know that they either have another week, another 2 weeks, whatever the time
is? That's a good question. And it's sort of hard to tell, but I would say from the rhythm, so it's really the governor's office that will decide. And from the rhythm of the way things have been announced lately, I think you might see the governor announced it a week to go. And of course, hiring people back is another thing you have to worry about. I mean, restaurants are already starting to try to bring people back. I think that's why some restaurants need for delivery, and takeout, which they can do now, because they wanted to get more people in the advance of this, full service. But yeah, you have to prepare now and just understand it might before you're allowed in.
Definitely. We had one question come in, our usual question about the Boston Marathon, and if it's going to happen or not. I saw on CNBC this morning, they had Stephen Ross, who's the owner of the Dolphins, talking about the NFL. Curious to know, obviously, the marathon we talk about every week, we have no idea, we have no inside information on if it will happen or not. But things like the MLBs were working on proposals, obviously with the Sox, the Patriots, the NFL is still scheduled as of right now to start on time. Any expectations? Let's talk about the NFL. I guess the NFL, they've had no delay in terms of their start date, or, even Stephen Ross was saying they're expecting to have fans in the stadiums for the start of the season.
Yeah, that might be a bit ambitious. I mean, I'm more tied into the live music and event scene than the sports scene. But from talking to the people in that business, none of them expect large crowds before the end of the year. So I would be surprised, but again, I have no inside information to this, whether professional sports will play to crowds in 2020. I think it would be a big surprise to many people. The marathon, we are going to hear the final verdict in a week or two, within maybe this week, definitely by next week. I sort of gone, because I'm registered, I went from hopeful to doubtful over the course of the last few weeks, particularly when the mayor, like many communities in Massachusetts, have sort of ruled out any gatherings whatsoever for the months of June, July, and August. So how do you go from that to a race of 30,000? One suggestion is maybe we just have the elites. I don't know how many elites are in the marathon, maybe 50 to 100. Maybe we just have the elites run the race. But even that seems like a logistical challenge that might, and the economic and charity benefit would not be the same. So it's a tough call, but I think I don't see how you do a 30,000 person road race from Hopkinton to Boston in September. Sadly, because I'm registered, I really want to run, but I don't know. Yeah. I just don't know how we flip the switch.
You'll be in the elite.
Yeah, that's what I got to do. I got to qualify for the elites. I still have a couple weeks to pull that off.
There you go. Where did you hear about the final verdict on the marathon in the next week or two? Is that?
Oh, the mayor is asked almost all the time now. Yeah, he's sort of, I think he must realize, I haven't talked to him about it, so I don't, but he must know that it seems strange for him to say no events all summer and we still have a marathon in September. And I think as recently as Friday, maybe, he said, yeah, we'll have a decision in the next couple of weeks. We have to have this wrapped up. So I imagine the BAA, which runs the marathon, is looking at the different options of, can they refund the money? I mean, it's a lot of money to refund. Can they, is it possible to extend it, delay it later in the fall? There are still some marathons later in the fall. Is that a hope? I mean, it's just so hard to schedule this and get this arranged with all the towns. It's not as if you're just kind of running on a closed track. You're closing major streets through several communities and the city. So a lot of things have to be done. Like I said, another option is elite only. I honestly have no insight into where they've settled on that, but we'll know very soon.
Gotcha. So one question I have is, we've talked a lot about, PPP, unemployment, things like that. Are there any positive things that you hear, coming out of the economy? Is it, businesses coming together? Obviously, we have our Slack group, which has been, definitely a positive. But from business owners directly, or even employees, Any positive momentum that's come out of this, or is it mainly just, the struggle that we have talked about kind of week in, week out?
Well, I think, we've talked about this before. I think one positive thing is the pivot that, a lot of companies are having to kind of rethink or expand what they do, particularly companies that weren't really digitally enabled before. Maybe we'll see, delivery or curbside pickup even after stores open as an option. Certainly, we'll see more digitally enabled, the brick and mortar businesses that we love are going to have to adapt and be, maybe we'll see a better payment system, or, you can just kind of browse things before you go to a store, that sort of thing. I think there's some benefits from that. Unfortunately, that comes with a lot of downsides too. The more people switch online, and it's a pretty significant shift right now for obvious reasons, the more it's tougher to go back, I think, for a lot of people. And that's going to change a lot of our main streets and our downtowns for the worse. The ones that survive, I think, will be more, better equipped to make it in the future. And maybe this is sort of the sort of accelerating change that was going to happen anyway in the retail business. So it's more painful. But it's, I like to be hopeful and think that you small business owners are resourceful and can figure out a way through this. It's a very, very tough time.
Definitely. So my last question, then also feel free to add any more thoughts that you have on anything else unrelated. What's your outlook, this week moving forward as we move into, the phased approach? Any, expectations that you have, from the weeks that we've been, talking about this and kind of evaluating things? Anything that you're looking out for? Any specific industries that, you're particularly paying attention to? Anything like that, moving forward, as this week is kind of the first week, at least in Boston, that really anything's changed business-wise. So,
well, I mean, like I said, I'd be very curious to see how retailers handle this. It's been pretty slow how they handle curbside pickup. How do you, you want to be able to feel and touch and try on clothes, and that's challenging with curbside pickup. I think the salons are going to be booked. They're going to do well. Construction will be interesting to watch, and offices. I think construction will bounce back faster than offices because you can do physical distancing at construction, and because the construction companies, you can't do that remotely. You have to be there. So I think we'll see construction, and even in Boston, we're seeing all the major projects, or I would say not all of them, but most of them are back in action. And we'll see the vast majority of that. What will be interesting to see is which projects lose their financing because of this. And that could, a few projects could fall by the wayside as a result. And then the slow march back to the office will be very interesting to watch. I think companies will start bringing some people back in June, but it's going to be a real slow shift.
Gotcha. Well, we'll be back next week, 10 a.m. on Tuesday. We'll have a lot more to talk about, right, with the reopening. I'm sure you're going to get a lot of information this week and updates and things like that. So we're definitely looking forward to that conversation. John, where can people contact you if they're new to tuning in? Where can they reach you?
As always, the best way to get me is email, and that's jon.chesto@globe.com, john.chesto@globe.com. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions about what we discussed, or you need a link to some of those forms that I mentioned at the state. Though they are pretty easy to find, if you just if you've got a good tip or just want to say hi, send me a note.
There you go. Awesome. Yeah, we'll be back next week. We're looking forward to it. Next week should be good with all the new information. Thanks everybody for tuning in, whether it was your first or your fifth. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to everybody next week.